In order to break down the Arabs, I gave you a rundown, a summary, a shorthand to be exact. But what we need to do is talk about them in detail and how they came to dominate the northern part of Africa. Now, to understand this, you have to understand a couple things. One is that the Berbers are not a majority tribe in any of the parts of North Africa. And to be honest, they never really existed in any part of Egypt. See, the Berbers are more a concept than a people, even though they are a people in the truest sense. A lot of them and their skin color would be pale simply because of the Romans who came in and mated with a lot of the people. Now, there was a lot of other people who came from other parts of the Middle East. But forget that information. Let's talk about how the Arabs became the dominant group. So if you look at any statistic, let's just use Wikipedia, which sources it from the census done in these countries. Let's start with Algeria, one of the biggest nations in North Africa. There's really four that we need to talk about, which is Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya. So as you can see, in Algeria, 73% of the population identifies as Arab. In Libya, it's a staggering 92% of them who define themselves as Arabs. In Libya and in Tunisia, they have a similarity in that the overwhelmingness of the Arabs are huge. So obviously in Tunisia, 98% of them define themselves as Arabs. But this is not a arbitrary word that they picked up. As I showed you, people who are Arab are not just Muslims. Because of course you have people like the Persians, you have people like the Byzantines, all these people who from the left of the Arabic regions, they no longer define themselves as Arabs. The only people who define themselves as Arabs are people who historically have genetic ties to the Arab race. And so it's very suspicious that these people consider themselves that way. But why would they do this? Why would these people consider themselves Arabs? What tie do they have? If they are, as a lot of people make the mistake, conjecture, is that these people are the natives of North Africa. They've always been the natives of North Africa and they don't change. Now, you're probably thinking, isn't there one country you're missing? What about Egypt? See, Egypt has had so much going on in terms of propaganda that I cannot use Egypt. So let me show you why Egypt is kind of useless as a demographic, because today they identify as Egyptians because the history of Egypt is one that should be adopted if one is smart. They realize that tying yourself to Egypt will make you fancier than how all the other people tie themselves to the Arabs, which to some degree were not looked at as very sophisticated in the times of ancient history. So let's talk about this. From Al Jahiz's book, he mentions a tribe of black Arabs. These black Arabs would become even blacker on meeting Abraha. They are not the only group that existed. They are the Bedouins, and then of course there's the Banu, everything else. Now the word Banu is important here because the word Banu is one of those words that I've always talked about, those words in Arabic, which is a switch of another word, ibn. So you've always heard this word, IBN, ibn Fakhir, ibn whatever. Ibn means the son of. Banu means the children of. And yes, I do understand how interesting it is that Bana in Bantu languages means the children, and Banu in Arabic is the children of. But let's move on. It says by Al Jahiz, this is 829 AD. This is before the Banu Sulaim moved out of Arabia. So they're stuck in Arabia at this moment. We say that God did not make us black in order to disfigure us. Rather, it is our environment that has made us so. The best evidence of this is that there are black tribes among the Arabs, such as Banu Sulaim, and that all the people settled in the Hara besides the Banu Sulaim are black. These tribes take slaves from among the Ashban, the mind their flocks and to mind their flocks and for irrigation work, manual labor and domestic service, and their wives from among the Byzantines, and yet it takes less than 3 generations for the Hara to give them all the complexion of the Banu Sulaim. This Hara is such that the gazelles, ostriches, insects, and wolves are all black. Now, there is a reason why I'm reading this because the Banu Sulaim are an exception in the Arab world who happen to be black in color. So black that they are mentioned in many others as descending from the Hamites, right? Now, these people, like I said, met with Abraha as well. Now, like I said, Banu Sulaim means that there is a person, a human, who they are thought to descend from as a group. And there are many different types of groups of Arabs who, like I said, they trace their parenthood all the way back to Arabia, no matter where they live. While some of these Arabs trace themselves to Salim ibn Mansur ibn Ikhrami ibn Khashafa ibn Khais Alan, the other groups do not trace themselves to this. And so let's look at what those people are thought to be. Now remember, Upper Egypt and Southern Egypt is the same thing. Now people make giant mistakes and always say Upper Egypt and then they put a map saying that this Arab group migrated to Upper Egypt and then they put them in the northern part of Egypt. But the north is not Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt is the south of Egypt. This image represents Banu Hilal. Banu Hilal is another tribe in the Arabian areas. In fact, they represent a confederation of tribes. Now, these tribes, known as Banu Hilal, were migrated to Upper Egypt. You can tell the way they depict themselves that they consider themselves blacker than the normal people. Now, here's the thing amongst the Arabs, darkness is a typical feature, not a rare one. And because of the migration of the multitudes of people from outside of the Arabic areas, those people's genetics has changed dramatically. But of course, this darkness as well is not necessarily due to isolation, but instead can be traced to the E1 genetic from Africa. But let's leave that alone for now and talk about how they migrated into Africa. So we have documents, multiple of them, that talk about how in the 8th century, that was the first migration into Egypt by the Banu Hilal, including the Banu Sulaim, everybody. They migrated into there in the 8th century in small numbers. Small numbers meaning 30, 40,000 people. And then in large numbers in the 11th century. So if we read from Wikipedia, we can see the Banu Hilal were a confederation of Bedouin Arab tribes They were part of the Carmarthian revolt against the Abbasids. They migrated from Upper Egypt in North Africa in the 11th century to the Maghreb, having been sent by the Fatimids to punish the Zirids for abandoning Shi'ism. Their number is estimated to have been 50,000 warriors and 200,000 Bedouins. When they invaded Ifriqa in 1051 to 1052 under Abu Zaid al-Hilal, other authors suggest that they were the grassland tribes on the left bank of the Upper Nile who moved into East Africa because of the environmental degradation that accompanied the medieval warm period. The Banu Hilal quickly defeated the Zirids and seriously weakened their Hamadi neighbors. Their arrival was an important factor in the linguistic and cultural Arabization of the Maghreb and in the spread of nomadism in the areas where agriculture had been dominant. Ibn Khaldun noted that the lands devastated by the Banu Hilal had rendered the Sahara Desert completely arid. They were led by Abu Zaid al-Hilal. Their story is narrated in fictional form in the epic of that they were among the driving forces behind Arabization due to their political influence from their emergence until the 14th century. The Banu Hilal were an autonomous force to which all the Maghreb states turned for defense. Now you can see here that we're not talking about small numbers. We're talking about 200,000 Bedouins. Remember, Bedouins are Arabs from Arabia. Now you're probably thinking, okay, well, that makes sense, but that's only a couple 100,000 people. Well, I understand that, but what about the fact that there's so many other Arab tribes that migrated into North Africa? Now keep in mind, Africa has always been a easy direction for any tribe that existed in Arabia. And they've been doing this for thousands of years, moving back and forth between Africa and Arabia, taking African genetics into Arabia and taking some Arab genetics into Africa as well. Which I got a pretty weird comment where someone was like, "Oh, the ones who are light skinned in Ethiopia is due to mixing with Arabs." Yeah, I said that in the video because even the dark skinned ones are mixed, but then of course because the people of Arabia can be the natives of Arabia can be very, very dark, you don't realize that mixing with Arabs doesn't mean you're gonna be pale skinned, even though some people wanna believe that. So we see here, I mean, keep in mind the temperature of, Arabia is about the same as the temperature of, Africa. But let's read. Banu Kalib, that's another group that migrated into Africa. Banu Tamim, there's a lot of those in Algeria and Tunisia. Banu Kalb, Banu Tay, and all of these groups here all migrated into Africa by the thousands, hundreds of thousands. Three historians agree on the fact that Sigilimasi, which is located in Morocco, was a great trade partner with Ghana until that was closed, and their biggest trade partner became Egypt and Sudan. Now, another thing they agree on is that the Arabs moved from Arabia into Sigilimasi, into Upper Egypt, into those places. And the reason why they did this was because of tyranny. Now, of course, this is something that is well known by historians, something that is obvious by historians, but highly denied by so many people all over who try to talk about the history of North Africa with a bend, a bias. They say, look at North Africa. If we look at North Africa today, we can tell that the majority of the people are pale of skin, they look like other Arabs, and they descend from other Arabs, despite the fact that there's been DNA tests that test people who say they're Berber and people who say they're Arab, and they can notice a sharp difference in history, and they can notice a higher turn towards African DNA within the even the pale skinned people who claim to be Berber, that these two people do not come from the same original pot, and that the North African regions, though a melting pot in a sense, became even more meltier or more melting pot like as the time went on, and eventually peaking at about the 1400s, where Arabs had become the dominant power. Now, of course, North Africa is a very fascinating place outside of the racial aspects, but let's first think about the several groups that moved into Africa over the years. So, if we start with 100,000 years ago, what we start with is a group of people who have been there for a long time, in fact, maybe a million years, because some of the oldest skulls in Africa, which are traced to be similar to the rest of Africa, are found in North Africa. Then, of course, you go to about 10,000 BC and you start to see this, new type of occupation where these people who are African are starting to settle in a different way. And now the nomadic lifestyle of the people who lived in those regions was selective. Not everybody who lived in those regions were nomadic. In fact, their culture was almost the same as those living to the south. The pottery and everything is the same. Then later we start to see a bigger increase, pottery and all that stuff, and some things that are moving in from Egypt. The Arabs, or whatever you want to call them, let's call them the people living in the Fertile Crescent, their influence is being felt in terms of their trade, is being felt deep in those regions. There is a give up region where there's a give up time where we start seeing Greeks and Romans come in and land in those areas, bringing in other groups of people as well. Now, this is an interesting point because Greeks are Europeans, right? Romans, Europeans. So you would expect a much higher European DNA, especially amongst the Berbers. But really, the groups that the Berbers represent for the most part is a Middle Eastern DNA, the ones that exist now who are called Berbers now. They have a Middle Eastern DNA and then they have an African component. So what can this tell us about the history? Well, it tells us that it wasn't that big. Remember, Herodotus wrote that there are four groups living in that area at his time, 500 BC, and he said the majority of them are Ethiopians. The second are what he called the Libyans, which is vague. And then he said, then it's the Greeks, and and then he said there's two foreign groups that live in that area, and he stated that the majority of them are in power positions. In other words, meaning that these are colonizers who didn't change the demographic, but instead took over the regions, took over the lands. And then he mentioned that the Ethiopians are on either side of the Libyans. In other words, if you go from Egypt all the way to Chad and those regions, Ethiopians. Then you have Libya and the Libyans in those regions. And then on the other side of Libya, which is you get Tunisia and places like that, Ethiopians again. Now, before I read this is from Herodotus himself. But remember that the words that I'm talking about are related to Arabs living in Arabia, Ethiopians living in Ethiopia, Ethiopia meaning Sudan today, and places like that, even Egypt in some cases. This has nothing to do with the modern names. North Africa was not considered Arabic in any sense or form. So be careful of how you interpret what I'm about to read. So the following leaders commanded them. Arsamas, son of Darius, led the Utians and the Mysians and the Syrometres, son of Ibiz, the Parisians, the Arabians wore cloaks fastened by a girdle and carried on the right side long bows which bent backwards. The Ethiopians were cloaked in panthers and lion skins and carried long bows not less than 4 cubits in length, made from branches of the palm tree, and on them they placed short arrows made of cane, instead of iron tipped with a stone which was made sharp, and of that sort on which they engrave seals. Besides, they had javelins, and at the tip was an antelope horn, made sharp, like a lance. They had also knotted clubs. When they were going to battle, they smeared one half of their body with chalk, and the other half with red ochre. The Arabians and Ethiopians who dwell above Egypt were commanded by Arsamas, son of Darius, and Atrasin, daughter of Cyrus, whom Darius loved more than all his wives, and whose image he had made of beaten gold. The Ethiopians from the sunrise, for two kinds of Ethiopians served in this expedition, were marshaled with the Indians and did not at all differ from the others in appearance, but only in their language and their hair, for the eastern Ethiopians are straight haired, but those of Libya have hair more curly than that of any other people. These Ethiopians from Asia were accoutred almost the same as the Indians, but they wore on their heads skins of horse heads as masks, striped off with the ears of a mane, and the erect and defensive armor they used the skins of cranes instead of shields. The Libyans marched clad in leathern garments and made use of javelins hardened by fire. They had for their general Massagus, son of Orissus. The Paphlagonians joined the expedition, wearing on their heads plated helmets, and carried small shields and not large spears, and besides javelins and daggers, and on their feet they wore boots peculiar to their country, reaching up to the middle of their leg. Now, there are some people who ask the question, when Herodotus says that the Ethiopians and the Egyptians are black, how do you know that he's saying that they're the same? Well, it's because Herodotus goes out of his way to make a difference between different tribes, even two Ethiopian tribes, as you see in those cases. He says the Ethiopians, which are marshaled with the Indians, which he calls Eastern Ethiopians, because they live in Arabia, which are marshaled with Indians, meaning that the Indians are not the Ethiopians he's talking about. He says they have straight hair. Who do you think he's talking about? It's very likely that he's talking about one of these tribes, like the Banu Sulaim or anything like that, who are a mix between Ethiopians and Arabs. But to him, because they're so dominantly Ethiopian in genetics, they appear to just be Ethiopian. And of course, he talks about the Arabs, and he mentions how there are some Arabs stationed all over the Persian Empire, because of course the Persian Empire is extended, but he can still tell who came from where. Now, it's important to know that Libya is written about by Herodotus in a very specific way, and he mentions the tribes that were located in Libya. In this sense, he's not talking about the entire continent of Africa when he says Libya. In Libya, he means that specific region of North Africa. So, really, it would be Morocco, Tunisia, only parts of other regions, but Libya is another one that would be part of it. And this is what he has to say. The Carthaginians further say that beyond the pillars of Hercules, there is a region of Libya and men who inhabit it. When they arrive among these people and have unloaded their merchandise, they set it in order on the shore, go on board their ships, and make a great smoke, that the inhabitants, seeing the smoke, come down to the sea and then deposit gold in exchange for the merchandise, and withdraw to some distance from the merchandise, that the Carthaginians then, going ashore, examine the gold, and but if the quantity seems sufficient for the merchandise, they take it up and sail away. But if it is not sufficient, they go on board their ships again until they have satisfied them. Neither party ever wrongs the other, for they do not touch the gold before it is made adequate to the value of the merchandise, nor do the natives touch the merchandise before the other party has taken the gold. Such are the Libyans, whose names I have been able to mention, and most of these neither now nor at the time paid any regard to the king of Medes. But I have still this much to say about this country. Now, keep in mind, the country that he's talking about in this specific place is the one that is located next to the pillars of the pillars of Hercules in this region called Libya. So he's not even talking about the whole of North Africa. In real life, he's really talking about Morocco. As you can see here, the pillars of Hercules, one that is in Europe and the other one that is in North Africa. And really, he's talking about Morocco and Algeria, but we don't even need to talk about necessarily what he's talking about, because the next part will reveal the detail of who are the people living there. Notice, and I'll show you, that Herodotus talks extensively about Arabs, even Arabs in Africa, where he talks about how Cambyses and all these other people, they marshal the Arabs next to the Ethiopians. So Eastern Ethiopians in the Middle East are marshaled with Indians, Arabs, and other people like that. And then some Arabs are marshaled with Ethiopians south of Egypt. And that's just a fact that he says. But at no point does he mention that Arabs ever went as far as these regions, the Libyan areas. So the Arabs are newcomers to North Africa by the 8th century and the 11th century onwards. So we continue to read. He says, such are the Libyans, whose names I have been able to mention, and most of these neither now nor at the middle of the time paid regard to the king of Medes. But I still have this much to say about this country, that four distinct races inhabit it. Four distinct meaning different from one another, inhabit it, and no more as far as we know. Two of these races are indigenous, and two are not. The Libyans and the Ethiopians are indigenous. the one inhabiting the northern and the other the southern parts of Libya. But the Phoenicians and the Greeks are foreigners. No part of Libya appears to me as good in fertility as to be compared with Asia or Europe, except only the district of Sinips, for the land bears the same name as the rivers and is equal to the best land in the production of corn, nor is it at all like the rest of Libya, for the soil is black and well watered with the springs, and it is neither affected at all. Now, keep in mind here, when he says Libya, I stress again that he's talking about the desolate areas. He's talking about the desert, which he's talking about North Africa. But guess who's situated in North Africa? Libyans and Ethiopians. And even if you were to say, okay, Libyans are not Ethiopian or they're not black people in the sense of thingy, it would still leave you with the Ethiopians who are located deep in this area, this reddish climate, which he mentions in another part. He further breaks down the groups in another part where he says, um, so we read here. Afterwards, Cambyses planned three several expeditions, one against the Carthaginians, another against the Ammonians, and a third against the Microbian Ethiopians, who inhabit that part of Libya which lies upon the sea. And in forming his plans, he determined to send a naval force against the Carthaginians and against the Ammonians, a detachment of his land forces, and against the Ethiopian spies in the first instance, who were to see the table of the sun which was to exist among the Ethiopians, and besides to explore other things and to cover their design, they were to carry presents to the king. The table of the sun is said to be the following description. There is a meadow in the suburbs filled with the cooked flesh of all sorts of quadrupeds. In this, the several magistrates of the city, for some purpose, place the flesh at night, and in the daytime comes and feasts on it. The inhabitants say that the earth itself from time to time produces these things. Such is the description given of what is called the table of the sun. When Cambyses and had determined to send the spies, he immediately sent Elephantine for some of the that word, who understood the Ethiopian language, and while they were fetching these, he commanded the naval force to sail against Carthage, but the Phoenicians refused to obey, for that they were bound by solemn oaths, and that they should act immediately. This not only tells us that the Ethiopians lie to the east of Egypt or the west of Egypt, but they also lie to the east of Egypt. But this is not the only evidence that we have, because of course we have Herodotus adding extra context to this. So let's read here. He says, the Arabians wore cloaks fastened by a girdle, and carried on their right sides long bows which bent backwards. The Ethiopians were cloaked in panthers and lion skins, and carried long bows, not less than 4 cubits in length, made from branches of the palm tree, and on them they placed short arrows made of cane, instead of iron, tipped with a stone which was made sharp, and of a sort on which they engraved seals. Besides, they had javelins, and at the tip was an antelope's horn made sharp like a lance. They had also knotted clubs when they were going to battle. They smeared one half of their body with chalk, and the other half with red ochre. The Arabians and Ethiopians who dwell over Egypt were commanded by Arsamis, son of Darius, and Artistone, daughter of Cyrus, whom Darius loved more than all of his wives, and whose image had made of beaten gold. The Ethiopians from the sunrise, for two kinds served in this expedition. So let's pause right there. So you can see here that there are Arabs who are marshaled with the Ethiopians in above Egypt. In other words, in the area where e- so not upper Egypt but above Egypt. So the Arab areas in Israel, those locations, the Sinai, those locations, he put Ethiopians with Arabs to go attack. So they represent a sort of African Arab Sinai population. So who are these second Ethiopians that he talks about? If we know now that Arabs are sort of limited to Arabia. Well, let's see. The Ethiopians from the sunrise, for their two kinds served in this expedition, were marshaled with the Indians and did not differ at all from the others in appearance, but only in their language and their hair. For the eastern Ethiopians are straight haired, but those of Libya, keep that in mind, those of Libya have hair more curly than that of any other people. These Ethiopians from Asia, keep that in mind, these Ethiopians, they're not in Asia because they're being marshaled right now. They're from Asia, were accoutred almost the same as the Indians, but they wore on their heads, skins of horses' heads as masks, striped off with the ears and mane. And the mane served instead of a crest, and the horse's ears were fixed erect, and as a defensive armor they used the skins of cranes instead of shields. The Libyans marched clad in leathern garments and made use of javelins hardened by fire. They had for their generals Massagus, son of Ursus. The Paphlagonians joined the expedition, wearing on their heads plated helmets, and carried small shields and not large spears, and besides javelins and daggers, and on their feet they wore boots peculiar to their country, reaching up to the middle of their leg. The Ligyes and the Mauritanians, the Maradians, the Syrians marched in the same dress as the Paphlagonians. So you can see here that he makes a distinction between a couple groups. So let's talk about the four groups. These I would call the Eastern influence of Africa, and then I would call the other one the Western influence of Africa. So the Eastern influence of Africa bore two things. One, it bore Ethiopians from Asia, which were accoutred almost the same as the Indians, meaning he's not talking about Indians, he's talking about Ethiopians. And then he says that they are, the Libyans march clad, blah, blah, blah. So he says that the Libyans were also there in this expedition. This is important because it shows you that he makes a huge separation between Arabs and Libyans. So later, who people call Arabs and people call Libyans, it's funny because I've said this before. Arabs call themselves Arabs. Everybody else insists that they're not. So let's look at the demographics of Egypt today, especially on Wikipedia, and you will see why everything I'm saying is funny if you take what today Egyptians are told to believe. So if we look at the demographics of Egypt, we will see that the majority call themselves Egyptians as an ethnic group. Nationality, sure, they're Egyptians, but to call yourself Egyptian as an ethnic group is kind of wild, especially given that the culture and religion of that area is mainly Arabic. So let's see, what other groups do we have there? Minor ethnic groups: Copts, Bedouins, Turks, blacks, which break down into three groups: the Nubians, the Beja, Afro Arabs, and other blacks. Now it's interesting that the Afro Arabs are not Afro Egyptian, but we'll get back to that. Then you have the Doms, the Greeks, the Sims, and all these other people. There is no ethnicity known as Egyptian. The Egyptians died a long time ago as an ethnic group. The ethnic group that is today dominating Egypt are the Arabs, and you can see how they dominated the rest of North Africa. They cannot get, there were no airplanes back in the day. They could not get to those regions without going through Egypt, and they stationed themselves in Egypt. And guess which group was in Upper Egypt? Benu Sulaim. Benu Sulaim is one of the biggest groups. It was stationed in Upper Egypt. If you were to ask Herodotus what group is dominating Egypt to this day, he would say the Arabs, which I don't know why they're not proud of the fact that the Arabs have had such a major influence. They went from being a random tribe in Arabia that is looked down upon by the Persians, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, all these other people, to dominating for the most part, the most important parts of trade for a good 1,000 years. That's something to be proud of as Arabs. When we talk about Arabia, we can talk about any era, but let's talk about the era where the Abyssinians sort of got a hold of that area. So here we go. They were true believers professing the unity of God and did not belong to the Christian creed of this age, who professed the Trinity. Shocked at the cruelest, a man of the name of Duthalabin went to Caesar to ask him for his aid. The emperor wrote to the Nejashi, the king of Abyssinia, about the case as he was nearer. This gave origin to the invasion of Abyssinians in Yemen, who kept this country in subjection till Yusuf du Yasan solicited the assistance of several kings, which was the last granted to him by Anushirwan, as we have described in our book Akbar as Zeman and the Kitab al-Awsit or Kitab al-Aswat. And we shall give a summary of these events in the 43rd chapter. There we speak of Adwa, the king of Yemen. The story of the contrivers of the pit is mentioned. Okay, so you see here, when I say that even the Abyssinians, they were just people were just gallivanting all over that region, and the Abyssinians, through a random tip off, decided, oh, we're just gonna take over Yemen. We started off with Al Jahiz, and let's finish with him. Remember, Al Jahiz lived at the same time as Al Masudi, roughly. We do not gainsay that Abd Shams was himself noble, but there are a degree of nobility, and God gave Abd al-Muttalib during his lifetime such privileges, enabled him to perform such deeds of valor, and showed him such generosity, that the like could be found only in the prophet sent by God. His words to Abraha, the elephant man, this is the guy who took over Yemen, his threat to him invoking the Lord of the Kaaba, God's fulfillment of his word, the substance given to his threat by the stopping of the elephant and the slaughter of Abraha's companions, by the Abadal birds and the sigil stone, so that they were left like a field of corn ravaged by wild beasts. All that is the most wonderful of miracles and the most prodigious of signs. Now, the only reason I read that is to show you that it's not just one person who believed this at the time, and not just believed, but there's evidence of this. But there's multiple accounts of how the Yemenites were taken over by the Ethiopians, and even to this day, there is genetic continuity between Ethiopians and Yemenites. There's a lot of people from Yemen. Being fairly familiar with the tribes of Arabia, he is a great source. Not only that, he's a foreigner to Arabia in the sense that he himself comes from a Sudanese origin. And so when he writes about these several tribes, he does not write with bias. Remember, his first statement was that the Banu Sulaim are a black tribe, a tribe of people darkened by the sun, which was what they used to believe back in the day until, of course, genetics came along and showed that you can live in pretty hot areas and not be dark skinned.